Complex socio-environmental problems are all around us today. Locally, regionally, and globally, these problems span many issues and many environments. To address these problems requires full participation in decision-making from multiple disciplines and experiential perspectives. But in complex situations, it can be hard to make sense of the multiple dimensions and processes at play, and to prioritize impacts and pathways forward. Participatory modeling is one way to address this challenge. Welcome to this tutorial video on participatory modeling. I'm Moira Zellner. Today, I will show you how my colleagues and I have used a range of modeling approaches with stakeholders engaged in participatory decision-making processes. I will start by defining participatory modeling and its utility to tackle complex socio-environmental problems. Next, I'll discuss the core challenges related to the process, followed by a framework of practices that our group has found to be important for increasing stakeholder engagement and consequently, productivity of the process. To ensure that participatory modeling is useful, some important parts of the process are critical, and I will highlight a few. I will then illustrate many of the processes using a platform that my team at Northeastern University has developed. I'll close with a few words about why participatory modeling is worth it. Participatory modeling is a collaborative approach to formalize shared representations of a problem and through the joint modeling process, propose and test solutions to that problem. It links science and modeling with diverse stakeholder expertise and values. And most importantly, it uses modeling to support collaborative decision-making to co-produce and synthesize knowledge about a complex problem and potential solution paths. While science has traditionally emphasized objectivity, rationality, and expert-driven data collection and analysis for problem solving, participatory modeling emerges within a larger trend toward democratizing science for social learning and collective deliberation through iterative participatory processes. It is particularly well-suited to address complex social and environmental problems like climate change, social and economic injustice, and sustainable resource management, where interaction among multiple actors and factors make the causes and consequences of the problem unclear, and where a diversity of values and perspectives may lead to conflict about concrete pathways forward. Engaging in participatory modeling helps elicit and harness diverse kinds of stakeholder knowledge, formal or informal, explicit or tacit, scientific or experiential. So it helps move from focusing on conflict to building collective solutions, strengthening relationship building, empathy, trust, and system thinking. All of this increases the quality and durability of decisions that take place during the process. In recent years, and thanks to succinct support, scholars and practitioners who develop and conduct various forms of participatory modeling have come together as a community to coalesce this rapidly growing application of knowledge co-production. This has helped streamline the field in terms of standards for consistent reporting of participatory modeling cases, lessons learned, insights into aligning modeling approaches with problem types, and assessment of modeling products. Recently, Beatrice Hedelin and I worked with colleagues on a synthesis of case studies. This, and work by others, has contributed to the accumulation of experience on the various dimensions of participatory modeling that need improvement. Most notably, assessment of the modeling products and outputs. Despite all this potential for participatory modeling to inform planning and policy, this practice has yet to become a mainstream approach in planning and policy. The reasons are several, so let me mention some of the key challenges. First, it is hard to standardize the approach, as it must be heavily tailored to the characteristic and context of each planning problem, the urgency of the problem, and the diversity of and power relationships among stakeholders. Second, it requires a broad range of skills, not only domain knowledge, but social skills and technical skills, such as those associated with modeling and visualization. This range of skills means diverse collaborations are needed, which can also be a major challenge. Participatory modeling is improved by experience in facilitation and evaluation. And of course, financial commitment is needed to support and build the systems and tools that allow users and planners to test solutions to the problem, build capacity of facilitators and stakeholders, and create new insights to support democratic processes. The challenges are currently being addressed with more research on knowledge co-production, social learning, and ethical participation in scholarship practice, and more recently, in funding agendas. Much of the development of participatory modeling practices has focused on modeling tools and engagement techniques. However, to be effective, the focus must go far beyond modeling and engagement. I'll talk now about many of these and more generally about confronting the many challenges. Working with collaborators, I have developed a framework that explicitly acknowledges and integrates the relevant practices and techniques to guide the design of effective participatory modeling processes. Instead of focusing on the initial problem definition step, I will focus on aspects that tend to receive less attention and highlight what needs to be done. Developing profiles that reflect the diverse concerns and working with stakeholders to prioritize them is a critical step before moving on to co-develop models and move towards simulation and implementation of solutions. And these priorities must be made explicit, but the methods used to accomplish this may affect the prioritization itself. There are always many priorities on complex problems, and no single solution works for each person. For a democratic process, extensive deliberations must occur to reveal the different views and priorities. For example, a green infrastructure plan to tackle urban flooding may be very effective at capturing water through infiltration and storage, yet be prohibitively expensive for some communities to build or maintain. Or for areas that routinely flood, it may be more affordable to move households, yet residents may not be willing to leave their homes and their lifestyles and livelihoods behind. What is a better solution, and according to whom? How can these trade-offs be addressed in an equitable manner? Dealing with such issues is easier for the group if they can visualize the diverse views and potential solutions. Even when there are outliers, these can support productive conversations, innovation, and compromise. The next steps are co-identifying social and environmental variables that stakeholders care about, and then conceptualizing the relationships between those variables. In traditional scientific modeling, this is done in a modeling framework, but because models are foreign to many stakeholders, this can lead them to question the models as invalid or untrustworthy. To avoid this and continue with co-generation of knowledge around the problem, it is useful to build together conceptual diagrams or other simple tools that at least align with the modeling technique. While some stakeholders remain engaged at some level as the modeling effort transitions from qualitative to quantitative, most prefer to stay at the conceptual level of involvement. And doing so can be indispensable for keeping collaborative model building and sense-making stakeholder-driven, even if the coding is not. Choosing a particular modeling technique, such as a system dynamics approach that matches the complexity of the problem while engaging with a broad range of stakeholders, can bring tensions, especially if stakeholders are not open to experimenting with that technique. But keeping stakeholders engaged in conceptual reasoning using tools that match the technique can reduce those tensions. For example, stocks and flows diagramming tools could be used for system dynamics modeling or class and activity diagrams for agent-based modeling. Even so, the process of conceptualization and simplification, that is, drawing the model abstraction from the complex lived experience, is not straightforward even for seasoned modelers. Depending on the specific stakeholders involved, certain aspects of a complex problem may not be represented or may be deemed of little value. In addition, participants may have diverging understandings about the way in which certain system components may influence others, or how to conceptualize such influences. Allowing for extensive deliberation during model construction can address such barriers, and when not resolved, can help develop hypotheses to test through modeling. Another approach to ensure diverse aspects of the problem are represented is to iterate the process with different groups of stakeholders to achieve model saturation, a stage in the model building process where no new components or mechanisms arise from stakeholder engagement. Ultimately, the modeling process must be useful in testing different decision scenarios that support the design of policies. While significant insights for decision-making may have been derived from the co-development process, ensuring the modeling is useful requires a focus on accessibility of the model to a broad range of users for scenario development and exploration. It also requires meaningful visualization of outputs to support the deliberation of trade-offs and compromise-seeking behavior. Unless directly involved in model co-construction, the learning curve to use complex systems models may be very steep for novices. As the number of parameters increases, so does confusion about why the outcomes are the way they are. Without clarity, it is hard to suggest what kind of policies and where they may be implemented to make a difference in the desired direction. The ideal number of system components and variables in a model is something to be collectively defined and tested for each problem and set of stakeholders. Too many variables will make it hard to explore solutions and can quickly overwhelm the participants who are trying to consider potential solutions. Too few variables may leave out critical components that some participants value, so excluding variables should be deliberated on and agreed upon. Outsourcing the analysis should be avoided because it deprives stakeholders of the experiential, collaborative design and exploration of new interventions and sense-making of their outcomes. Without these experiences, it can be hard to trust the results coming out of proposed interventions, and more generally to adopt participatory modeling as an established practice for institutional decision-making. This can leave participatory modeling as an isolated intellectual experiment. Let me mention a few things that can minimize this. First, translating what participants learned into specific policy suggestions and concrete plans is essential, even if it means governance changes. This is not easy, especially if the modeling results conflict with pre-established favored solutions. Second, because trade-offs will emerge from each solution to a problem, these should be explicitly discussed and the solution's impacts be monitored and managed over time. Third, it is critical that participants be aware of the social learning they're engaged in. This can be accomplished by illuminating what was learned during discussions or by using pre and post surveys to show participants how much they have changed their views. Even in light of the understanding supported by participatory modeling and full discussions of trade-offs, unanticipated or unfamiliar effects and perception of risk often generate resistance. This resistance can arise if participants interpret the inevitable uncertainty of complex systems as doubt rather than as a range of possibilities. And this can feed into collective ambivalence about pathways forward and anxiety about the lack of accuracy. So a fourth way to minimize the potential for participatory modeling to become just an isolated experiment is to emphasize that uncertainty is inherent with any change. Moreover, it is even present when no change in policies are made. Instead, encourage the group to focus on the most robust policies that would be effective in a variety of possible futures. To help deal with the complex issues I have raised and help guide participatory modeling in practice, I'm excited to introduce you to Fora.ai, a new whiteboard platform developed at Northeastern University. Fora.ai is designed to support and scale up collaborative modeling and planning. It allows groups of stakeholders and decision makers, including scientists, modelers, citizens, and public officials, to collaborate for climate and social justice solutions. The platform allows users to define the problem, set the priorities, then co-design different solutions with others, run simulations to test these solutions, and deliberate about the trade-offs that emerge from each solution. This deliberation feeds back into solution co-design and testing, and sometimes even in the definition of priorities or the problem itself. Priorities are set by ranking individual preferences and their relative importance. Variables are used to represent the interests that participants have collectively defined as important. Once ranked, weights are provided as default, but users can adjust them so that the relative levels of importance across the variables can also be represented. For example, in the case of flooding and green infrastructure that I mentioned earlier, engineers might want to prioritize infiltration over everything else, while public officials may want to minimize investments and maintenance costs, and residents may want to minimize property damage. In Fora.ai, individuals can view these diverse priorities, whether they are sharing a collaborative session or not. This can support productive conversations around what people care about. In one of our projects, a spatially explicit process-based model that we developed called Landscape Green Infrastructure Design, or LGRID for short, is being integrated into Fora.ai. Participants work together with this model to design solutions to urban problems, including flooding, by placing green infrastructure tokens on their community map. Through the Fora.ai's whiteboard, participants have the ability to comment, ask questions, flag things, and get more detailed information about the interventions. They can also click on each landscape tile or cell to get more information about the place through layers of spatial data like elevation, land cover, and such. Proposed solutions, once co-designed and finalized, can then be submitted for simulation and evaluation where the areas of higher impact can be quickly identified and viewed from different perspectives and over time. From direct engagement in the development and use of the underlying L-grid model, the platform supports understanding of the biophysical phenomena. That makes teams better prepared to plan interventions to produce desirable outcomes. Simulation results from this and other models cannot by themselves provide answers. Human judgment must be involved in what the desired solutions and priorities are. This is what makes it a democratic process. And Fora AI supports that process by evaluating simulation results through the different concern profiles entered by participants. It highlights how each variable of interest contributes to each person's concerns, quickly identifying what the trade-offs are and what is driving them. The results are compared against a baseline with no intervention, as the intent is not accuracy, but relative improvement across scenarios. This feedback provides a basis for informed deliberation where differences are a source of innovation more than conflict. The iterative facilitated process of scenario building, testing, and deliberation supports productive collaboration towards implementable compromise solutions that we can all live with. In this manner, Fora AI democratizes decision-making through inclusive engagement in modeling and solution building, empowering communities with science and evidence-based reasoning, while harnessing their innovative capacity to jointly create pathways towards climate resilience and social justice. While we're very excited about what Fora AI can help us do, we're also mindful of the critical role that both facilitation and evaluation play in the successful use of such tools. Facilitation has been covered elsewhere, so I'll just mention a few things about assessment before my closing. Currently, there is a paucity of assessment in participatory modeling studies, particularly aspects of engagement. Instead, assessment tends to focus on participant satisfaction through pre- and post surveys. More in-depth assessments should focus on interactions among participants and with the modeling tools and simulations. Ideally, these would occur not only after engagement to look for changes, but across the entire modeling process. Assessments done during interactions allow for opportunity for reflection and feedback from the participants. This opens the door to better understand the transformations that participatory modeling fosters or not, and to adjust models, interfaces, and facilitation practices to better support the process. This can also lead to refining the pre-established goals and priorities of the participants as new knowledge is co-developed and values and preferences co-evolve. To enable this kind of assessment, we are building into Fora AI the ability to collect data from participant use and the ensuing scenario development, deliberation, and policy formulation. Participatory modeling is transformational, but requires a lot of work and long-term commitment and resources. Is it worth it? The evidence we've collected from our work suggests it is, even with so-called failures. The reasons are multiple. First, people have habits of practice and thought that distract them from discovering new possibilities. By visualizing and discussing complex biophysical processes at play and trade-offs around diverse values, participants are empowered to see gaps and differences and discuss whether and how to address them. Second, it's worth it because far too often communities work towards compromises that move plans further and further away from specifics until what emerges is a generalized best practice. This may gain consensus, but is so vague that it no longer holds any meaningful guidance. So, for example, plans may end up as, whenever possible, we should favor green infrastructure, instead of we should put this type of green infrastructure here. When participatory modeling processes are used, work is done to resolve conflict, not just push it back. Third, innovation happens through relationships with other people and can be enhanced by the use of tools as prosthetic devices for collaborative thinking and design. Models, interfaces, and facilitation structures need to be designed in ways to aid exploration, the evolution of understanding and valuation, allowing people to explore new possibilities, examine their expectations, and make practical judgments to plan for the future. We believe that consequences can be significant. The approach I have outlined supports a democratic process of working with difference rather than trying to eliminate it. And evidence is brought to bear through modeling, which allows true compromise to be reached in an informed way and in consideration of trade-offs. This evidence also allows for deliberation on how to best address the negative impacts of a chosen solution and ensure the fair distribution of the positive ones. Participatory modeling built upon socio-environmental systems modeling is a critical source for this kind of evidence. Thank you for listening. Please now enjoy comments by our panel of participatory modelers.
This is the point where we should have taken questions for Moira, but since we don't have her today, so we will move to the panelist presentations. So we will start with Juan. So Elena, would you like to start playing the video, please?
Hi, my name is Juan Castilla-Ro from the University of Canberra. Today I'd like to cast the first stone on a typology of problems that we're facing in participatory modeling. This is a humbling but necessary step to identify what we're doing well, what we're not, and where we should focus our efforts to improve our practice going forward. Simply put, PM is the result of the interaction of three domains: practitioners, people, and models, occurring within a process and funding that brings them together. I would like to propose that we're facing four types of problems based on the number of domains that are involved. Type 1 problems involve one domain, and I see them as fundamental problems. These are the most serious and difficult to solve. Type 2 problems involve two domains, and I see them as understanding problems. For example, people not understanding models, practitioners not understanding people, people not understanding practitioners, or even worse, practitioners not understanding models. Type 3 problems involve three domains. These are the problems that arise during a PM workshop, when practitioners, people, and models come together. Finally, we have type 4 problems relating to the process and/or funding that enables a PM exercise to take place. I will give one example of each type of problem and suggest that type 1 and type 4 problems are the ones we should really be worried about and the ones we should be tackling first. Type 2 and Type 3 appear to be simpler problems that can be solved with a combination of creativity and technical ability, and of course, a bit of luck. Time is limited, so I won't be able to go into specific details of case studies where these problems have arisen in my own practice. The typology is inspired by over 7 years of PM practice and dozens of workshop hours developing cognitive maps and agent-based models in projects dealing with water management and water governance in Chile and Australia. Let's start with the bad news first, a type 1 problem, and perhaps the hardest of them all. This is a problem that I have been struggling a lot with recently and to which I honestly can't find or see a solution, at least in the short term. It's the chronic shortage of practitioners that have the hard and soft skills to do PM. To do a good job at PM, you need to be good with models, and lots of models. What I mean by that is being able to understand and create models from different disciplines. You also need to be good with lots of people. By good, I mean being able to communicate with and understand people from different backgrounds and walks of life, with their baggage of biases, beliefs, and values. Say you're good with models and people. The models that you build also need to be understood and trusted by people. The models you build need to be relevant to and representative of the system under study. And if we're able to achieve all this, then the people will hopefully be able to better understand the system and steer it toward better outcomes. That is asking a lot from one person. I think that what makes a PM practitioner exceptionally good or comfortable with all these things are his or her education and life experiences. That said, personally, I don't think that training courses can really provide the full suite of skills that are needed to design and facilitate successful PM processes. Sure, it can provide the theory, principles, and technical elements, but the core skills required to pull it all together are developed through the experiences lived during our education, our jobs, hobbies, travel, and friendships. My wishful thinking and a long-term solution to this problem is to embed and teach PM practice in primary and high school education. Other examples of type 1 problems can occur when we don't have the right models or the right people to work with. That's why I see them as fundamental problems and why they're so difficult to solve. But fortunately, they don't happen very often, and they can be detected before even embarking on PM. Let's move on to more positive news. A type 2 problem at the intersection of models and people. How do we get people to understand and trust the models that we build? This is a problem that we face in every PM process. The difference to a type 1 problem is that in type 2, we have additional degrees of freedom. We can either build better models or find ways to work better with end users to ensure that they understand and trust the models that we're building for them. Let's make an important distinction here. Who needs to understand and who needs to trust the model? Usually, it's the technical stakeholders that need and want to understand the model. And usually, it's the layperson that needs to trust the model, but not necessarily understand it. This distinction has helped us make decisions on how models are presented to and used by the people we work with. The process we follow is very similar to driving a car. To build understanding, we use models analytically. We take the models and run them hundreds of thousands of times to evaluate the vulnerabilities and trade-offs between different strategies. This is equivalent to conducting a large number of crash tests on a car to assess its level of safety and reliability. To build trust, we use models playfully. We turn models into management flight simulators that give people the ability to explore for themselves the likely consequences of their own or others' actions. This is equivalent to people taking a car for a test drive in order to make a purchase decision. Building understanding and trust in this way takes time and money. In many of the PM projects we have undertaken, with a few exceptions, budget constraints have forced us to choose between the analytical or playful path, but not both. Now to a problem that I know many practitioners are facing. This problem has become more evident and pervasive during the pandemic and the transition to remote forms of facilitation using things like Zoom and digital whiteboard platforms such as Miro and Mural. This is a type 3 workshop problem that I call the spaghetti syndrome. I actually looked this up and discovered it's a real term in emergency medicine, used to refer to equipment congestion and a disarray of wires, tubes, and lines connected to patients in operating theaters. The spaghetti syndrome usually emerges during the first PM workshop, when the practitioner serves the audience with a saucy entanglement of concepts and relationships which are supposed to help them better understand the system. The customer's reaction comes quickly. Are you going to make us draw one of those spaghetti diagrams again? I will be the first person to admit to making this mistake multiple times. Actually 4 times. As proof, here are some plates of our homemade spaghetti. We actually found a very elegant solution to this problem: force-directed graphs. This algorithm arranges the graphs in a natural way, usually resulting in a symmetrical and clustered structure. The distribution of the different nodes is harmonious and well-balanced. With these force-directed graphs, the spaghetti can be disentangled as it is elicited on the fly. With a bit of Python code and Streamlit's open source app framework, we have begun developing a web-based platform called PySM Workbench to elicit, visualize, and analyze force-directed systems maps. The workbench is capable of computing a range of network centrality, controllability, path, and archetype detection analysis in real time during a workshop. Our hope is to build an open source community around this workbench. So if anyone is interested in testing it, please reach out. Overall, what this example suggests is that type 3 workshop problems can be addressed with a bit of creativity and technical ability. We have to share the bad news, so let's talk about the elephant in the room, the type 4 process funding problem. Sadly, PM projects are usually a one-off event, and most of the time there's no follow-through. PM is something people see on the side of the road as they cruise along the system's highway. This is at odds with the mantra of adaptive management: plan, do, evaluate, learn, and repeat. How do we turn PM from a sign on the side of the road to a beacon that helps us to project the consequences of our actions and decisions? We have a few ideas of how to go about this. The first is twisting the adaptive management cycle in the way shown in the figure. We do the planning in a PM environment from the bottom up, in a risk-free environment, followed by a top-down phase where we do evaluate and learn out in the real world, and so on. This needs a continuous model of funding which is non-existent in academia. As a solution, we're exploring the idea of engaging in academic industry PM secondments in NGOs and government agencies. Second, we need to be aware when the windows of opportunity are open to PM. The adaptive cycle model from the study of dynamics of ecological and socio-environmental systems can offer some clues. It suggests the opportunity for redesign, reorganization, and renewal mediated by tools such as PM is higher after periods of fragility and instability, such as floods, droughts, and bushfires. Outside of this window, the chances of initiating a PM process are much lower. To wrap up, we have a type 1 and type 4 problem. Type 1 problems are either fundamental issues or flaws of practitioners, models, and people, which are intrinsically hard to deal with, if at all. Type 4 problems allude to the lack of iteration and follow-through caused by traditional funding schemes and the limited windows of opportunity to begin a PM process. Type 2 and Type 3 are understanding problems that occur at the intersection of practitioners and people and models, practitioners and models, or all of them. These problems generally have more degrees of freedom to enable innovation and can be addressed with a bit of creativity and technical ability. As the saying goes, how do we get everything in the bucket? If we put the sand in first, we will leave no room for the rocks and pebbles. So let's get the big rocks in first.
Thanks, Juan. And now I will invite Laura for her presentation.
Great. Thank you, Sandes, and thank you, Juan, for that great kickoff. Let me just share my screen here. Hopefully this will work. All right. So thanks to Juan for setting the stage for all of us in terms of what are the major types of problems that we might see in participatory modeling today. What I'm going to talk about is a type 2 problem, but I'm going to argue that it could be indirectly a type 4 problem as well, because if we build more public support for participatory modeling techniques through people seeing their utility, it could be that there's more public support for funding and long-term interventions that involve participatory modeling. So I'm going to talk about, Juan mentioned the type 2 problem in terms of how do we get people and models to better understand each other. One perpetual challenge in participatory modeling is that the number of people that are in a room interacting around a model typically is limited, right? The largest group I've seen is about 300 people that can directly interact with the modeling process. And yet we're working in communities that may have thousands or even millions of people that need to absorb the lessons of systems change and participate in the systems change that the model is suggesting, right? And as Juan mentioned, the spaghetti diagram, the stock and flow diagram is not legible to all of those people. So how do we take that message of systems change and communicate around it in a way that people can really resonate with and get behind? I'm going to talk about a couple of techniques that we're using in Flint, Michigan. So the story of Flint literally fills books, so I'm not going to be able to do it justice here. But just briefly, for those of you unfamiliar with what happened in Flint, in 2014, a non-elected emergency manager appointed by the governor of Michigan decided to switch the water source in Flint from the Detroit public water system to the Flint River. And when that switch was made, the appropriate anti-corrosive chemicals were not added to the water. And so the lining of the lead pipes that were ubiquitous in the city leached into the water supply and created lead exposure for thousands of households, including thousands of children. This leads to long-term health impacts. And we were brought in as a group of participatory modelers from Michigan State University to particularly look at the Flint food system and how to transform it for better health and sustainability outcomes. This is particularly important in the wake of the Flint water crisis because a healthy diet can help mitigate the impacts of lead in the body, particularly for children. Children that are getting a nutritious diet have fewer problems with lead exposure later on in their lives. However, in Flint, there's a lack of access to healthy and affordable foods. It is a city that is in a state of what our community partners refer to as food apartheid. It's an area where there is not access to healthy and adequate food, and that has been perpetuated through decades of racial marginalization, economic marginalization. So one of the tools we're using to communicate the results of the modeling tools with stakeholders and vice versa is archetypes. For those of you familiar with the work of Donella Meadows, you know that archetypes are basically mini stories about system structure and behavior. They consist of a set of feedback loops operating together, and they help us to communicate complex systems patterns in a very relatable and accessible way. And so we're using these archetype tools to both gain stories from the community that we can use in our modeling work and communicate the results of the modeling work back to the community. So here's just an example of the way that that works. This is a direct quote from a focus group that we did in Flint with consumers and participants in the food system. And so this particular interviewee is saying, another thing I hear a lot, there's a fact that there's so much free food distribution. This means that people are less likely to support urban agriculture with dollars. If people expect it to be, well, maybe not expect, but if you have a free source of produce, you are less likely to purchase it. And these urban agriculture folks need to eat too. So what this person is describing is a classic shifting the burden to the intervener or addiction archetype in which the Flint food system has become, in a sense, addicted to the massive influx of food subsidies and free food that occurred in the wake of the water crisis and the pandemic. Now, these were well-intentioned, of course, to support families that were burdened by these double crises. And at the same time, all of that money going to emergency food undermined the ability of the food system to develop in a sustainable way. So this is what that looks like in a causal loop format. So we were able to take that story that told to us by the community partner and put it into a causal loop diagram and then into a simulation model. And we are now in the process of communicating those simulation model results back to the community using these mini stories. And one of the cool and exciting things is that Flint has a very lively public arts project, the Flint Mural Project. Go check it out on Facebook if you get the chance. It's really cool. You can see artists from all over the world have come to Flint to build these murals. And so we're going to be working with some of these artists to take the modeling results and communicate them in a visual way using visual stories to the community, which I'm really excited about. I haven't seen anything like that before, but our project manager in Flint is helping us with that. So the remaining questions I have, in the wake of doing this work is, I think there is a general question of how do we best facilitate discussions of systems change across diverse audiences? I don't think this is a trivial question. I don't think it's something that, we have answered yet. I mean, I'm even finding throughout this project that the way that we talk to different groups of people in Flint has to be different, and we have to learn how to, change in that cultural appropriate way of communicating. The criteria by which communities and decision makers evaluate the credibility of the model is very different. For community partners, they want to see that the model reflects their lived experience because they're used to that being ignored by decision makers. For decision makers, they often have, a very much more technical definition of what credibility is. And then how do we communicate complex concepts in accessible ways without losing the complexity of the model and the value of the model in illuminating that complex systems behavior? And so archetypes is one way that we're trying to do that, but I'm sure there are many other ways, and I'd love to hear from the audience and from all of you, my fellow panelists, about how you've done that in your own work. So I will stop there and
Thanks, Laura.
pass it to the next panelist.
Excellent. Thanks, Laura. Nagesh, please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, so I am Nagesh. I come from India. I teach at the university, Rural Agriculture University. So I will talk briefly about the challenges I faced in the field and how we tried to overcome using a case study of participatory water accounting in a village. So basically, this village that we studied closely worked with, I also settled down for a few years in that village. So it used to have a profitable agriculture during the 80s and 90s. And suddenly the whole bubble collapsed in 2001, from 2001 onwards. So what was the cause? It was basically the groundwater that the agriculture was dependent upon. It kept going down. In the 80s and 90s, it was at 50 feet. Then by 95, it came down to 250 feet, then 400 feet. Eventually by 2001, 2002, around 600 feet. And after that, we could go deeper, but we wouldn't get any water. So if you talk to the farmers, their thing was it is climate change, less rain. So what government should intervene and increase recharge into the groundwater from rainfall. Whereas what we tried doing was we tried to carry out a participatory water accounting along with the stakeholders, try to see what the true cause was. So we felt we came out, it was a little different. For example, in the 1970s, there were only 76 wells that were bullock driven, whereas 80s and 90s, the tube well technology came, and then the number went up almost 1.5 times to about 200. Simultaneously also, apart from cattle driven, now motors were pumping water. So output increased about 3 times. Number of hours that bullocks could only work a few hours in the early morning hour, whereas these electric motors could work many more hours. Together, the amount of water being extracted was about 13 times more than what they were doing earlier. That is the cause why the water table kept falling, not so much the rainfall problem. For example, the amount of water extracted, discharged to recharge is to be same order of magnitude, 1 order of magnitude, whereas it became an order of magnitude more during the 80s and 90s. So the situation went back to before. So what they have exhausted all the reserves. In 2001, they were now getting whatever water they were getting in the 70s. Now, who is the loser? Each farmer had sunk many lakhs, millions of rupees in these tube wells. That is their waste now. Whereas recurring cost, instead of tapping water from 50 feet using bullocks, they were now drawing water from 600 feet, sending the water down to 600 feet, picking it back up, using subsidized electricity from the government. The recurring cost falls on the government. These were the kind of things we took to people. And the same situation continued until next 15 years. The amount of water continues to be the same. And so we used to use group discussions and individual things, participatory. But the main challenge that I saw was how to get people to, they were all able to understand this, how to act on these findings. Because as soon as rains came back in December 2015 cyclone, immediately you can see these water bodies full. Last 7 years, things have been good. But immediately they've gone back to again extracting far more water than their in a sustainable way. So what I find is when we the solution I find to this challenge of planning is to plan for implementation while modeling itself. For example, here is one proposal being discussed, how we can interlink the tube wells and farms in a village. If such a things were discussed and implemented, then people are willing to look more long term how to use water in a sustainable way. Otherwise, it becomes each farmer, whoever has access to water, wastes water. Whoever doesn't have water suffers because there's no way to share or trade in water. Next is another challenge that I found is you need to probe a lot when you work with these stakeholders, at least the ones that I dealt with, semi-literate in Indian villages, because what is there in their mind doesn't rarely come out. They're always trying to think along with you in your direction when you facilitate. So, for example, as engineers, we were always caught in technical efficiency of water harvesting systems when we were going about designing. Whereas there are so many social efficiency sides. For example, social equity. Which segments of society are benefiting by locating a structure in a particular place? What are the upstream and downstream spatial equity issues? And if we put a structure in a particular place, are the surrounding stakeholders showing sufficient initiative to maintain it subsequently? And maintenance is a big issue, so it's better you design structures that need least. So these are all factors that initially we overlook, but which required considerable amount of probing all the loose statements that were hanging around and trying to build. This is one problem I see quite often in my fellow colleagues' work in India, at least. Other I find is trust. it is best that the stakeholders gather data and help them build models. Even it takes longer, it is easier for us to go in and build. For example, here we were helping their children, school-going children and their school teachers gather data and make maps. The trust element improves much more when you do this. These are the 2-3 things, the challenges that we found, and we tried in our own way. Over to you, Sonia.
Thanks, Nagesh, so much. So this is the time where we have questions from the participants. Caroline, questions started coming?
Yes, we have a question which I think is directed at all of the panelists or those who think they would like to answer it. Rachel Mason says, I'm interested in hearing more about uncertainty in participatory modeling with the classical methods of errors that I'm familiar with from the hard sciences. You'd probably conclude that you hadn't learned anything from the simulations. But clearly, participatory modeling is a powerful and necessary tool, regardless of the uncertainties. So what helps people choose a course of action in the case of considerable uncertainty? Do you typically evaluate whether you were right after the fact, and when you're wrong? Does that turn out to be a big problem for the process? So who would like to take that on? Laura, Nagesh?
My experience, uncertainty, at least in my context, the data is data paucity. It's very short. Data shortage is very common in my case, and the model also. So best is to expose the model to people so that they play around with various inputs, parameters, and see how sensitive it is, so that they can make their own judgments. Is how I have tried.
Anyone else?
You hear me?
Yes.
Yes, Juan, go ahead.
Yeah. Yeah. Another way to treat uncertainty is obviously running the model many times and do the more classical analysis, but that depends on the type of model you're using. Probably with a system dynamics model, it's easier than with an agent-based model where every run is a bit different. And also, in one of the projects we're working on at the moment, doing participatory modeling for helping the water regulator in the state where I live to deal with water theft. They've said that even, like Nagesh was saying, even being able to play with the model and touch and run scenarios themselves is better than making an educated guess. And I thought that said a lot about what this process can do for them.
Great answers both, and I'll just add that in participatory modeling, we talk about 2 kinds of uncertainty. We talk about parametric uncertainty and structural uncertainty, or epistemological uncertainty. And, I would imagine that in the hard sciences, you're primarily dealing with the first one, right? Where you are trying to figure out whether the data you have, the inputs you have, the variables you have are leading to the right outcome. In participatory modeling, we're also thinking about, do we have the right model? Are we asking the right questions? Are the right people who have certain views of the system involved in the process? And I actually think that participatory modeling is much stronger on the structural and epistemological uncertainty than a classical modeling approach, even if you have a bit more uncertainty sometimes in some of the parameterization. So I'd really encourage you to look into the literature on that. There's a really great literature on uncertainty in modeling that deals with those different kinds.
We have another question from Tony Clem. How can we use participatory modeling to combine stakeholder demands for ecosystem services and landscape appearance, which are often qualitative data, to inform numeric agricultural models, for example, yield models, decision support systems on what best to grow given these constraints?
Something comes to mind. We've had this problem in a number of projects, and one solution we came across is fuzzy logic as a way to encode people's the more subjective knowledge and understanding about the system. And we found it provides a really elegant way to encode for that understanding and integrating that understanding into more traditional numerical models.
I would just say that you absolutely can use participatory techniques with existing kind of biophysical models. That has been done. One way that you can do it is by designing, scenarios and management and intervention, the kind of things that the model can code for. I think participatory processes are also a great way of understanding maybe some of the limits and shortcomings of these models. Are the things that they haven't considered that the community can identify and a way of making the model better in a sense. So I think they can work very well together.
Good point. Okay, shall we move on, or Nagesh, did you want to add anything?
So one thing I found in my limited experience in the semi-literate world is the stakeholder perceptions, which we don't find objective, are also equally important. Finally, they are the end users of these. They are not able to express themselves, but we can use that as a benchmark to evaluate our models. Actually, even their perceptions, though they look subjective. So from what I understood, biophysical, they are quantitative and etc. But finally, whatever models we build have to answer the concerns and perceptions of people, even if they look subjective and not as valuable. Yes.
Thank you, Nagesh. The other two questions are not questions, they're comments. Margaret Aout says, thank you so much for the informative presentations. I would like to engage and learn more on Fora AI. And Rachel thanks you for your response earlier. We have from Dale Rothman, can you use fuzzy cognitive modeling directly?
Yes, you can. Actually, the problem with fuzzy modeling is the name. It scares people away. It scared me for a long time from using it, and I rediscovered it recently. And what's really nice about it is that the engine that actually does the modeling are plain sentences in plain English. So that to me is the most appealing thing of it. And I think we're only touching the surface in how to apply these methods in participatory modeling. But it's something you can put it in front of an audience in a workshop, and they will be able to read and understand it. And at the same time, it's something you can use for actual, like, more empirical modeling.
Good, great, thank you, Juan. We have then another couple of questions. We have from Axel Campana. Is there any literature on how participatory models or outputs from participatory modeling processes are used in decision making? I'm sure the answer is yes, but perhaps some of you would have some concrete suggestions.
Right. I guess as a yes or no question, so the answer is yes, I guess, but yes, to elaborate on that more. So one of the reasons Dr. Zellner mentioned in her talk, the effort through CSync that we had to kind of standardize reporting on a lot of these efforts, because there's a lot of case studies in the literature that are giving particular cases of what you just asked for, like how was participatory modeling used in decision making, what was the outcome. But there hasn't really been a great way of standardizing the reporting on that so that you can easily kind of pull all those examples and come to broader conclusions. So we've proposed that over the last couple of years, and hoping that more participatory modelers will take that up and use that to report their results. But yeah, I will just say briefly, yes. And if you want a good kind of start to looking into that, you can go to some of the papers that came out of that CSync pursuit, where we're summarizing a lot of the literature on participatory modeling, which Moira mentioned in her talk. And you can find certainly some case studies there of how that was done.
Great. Thank you, Laura. Good. Then I think Axel's comment is simply following up from the last question. And then we have Dale, what engine are you using?
This is in relation to fuzzy cognitive mapping
Okay.
question.
That's right.
Yeah, so the engine, they're English statements, if-then statements, and you can list those during a workshop, and you can do it in a whiteboard very simply just ask people to go at the front, or even if you're doing it in a digital whiteboard setting, you can design really interesting activities so people can build that inference in a participatory way, and then you can use all sorts of tools to turn that into models. So that's not the interesting part. Is how do you how people can actually participate in eliciting the inference for these models.
Okay, thank you for elaborating on that. Sondas, you want to?
Yes,
follow up?
thanks, Caroline. So keep the questions coming, and in the meantime, we can start our panel discussion. So perhaps I would invite you all first to reflect on each other presentations, and if you have questions for each other, the panelists. So please go ahead.
Sondas, can I ask one question, please?
Shoot, Margaret.
Sure, this is Margaret. Sorry, I couldn't enter it into the Q&A for some reason. This is a two-part question, but I think they're related. So, and I'm going to play devil's advocate a little bit. It seems to me that there's a problem with, well, I guess my first question is, isn't participatory modeling, again, devil's advocate, mostly an academic process, one? And two, in terms of who initiates it, two, it seems like there's a catch-22 in that if academics initiate participatory modeling exercises and decide to make them participatory, often they have their focus before they engage the stakeholders that might be part of that exercise. And so our experience at SYNC is that teams would sometimes go down a path that was of little interest or relevance to the stakeholders. And so I guess I'm interested in how these are initiated in your experience, to what extent it is or is not just an academic exercise, and how we can move forward to change that.
Yes, Juan, please go ahead.
Thanks, Margaret. And we faced that issue a number of times. And one solution we've come with is placing a model very early in the process. We try to start the engagement with a prototype model, and that seems to it helps filter out the key issues and expose people to the techniques and strategies we're trying to use with them, and then we can gauge more or less what kind of models we're going to use and engagement strategies we're going to use. And the other thing, and I'd like something that Nagesh said, and you mentioned the word academic, and I feel with this we also need to be more human with the make the practices and our strategies more human. And I think Nagesh touched on a few ways of how to do that. So yes, this is an academic exercise, but I think we need to be more human. We need to get closer to the people that we work with, spend more time with them. So things that probably we don't get to do very often in academia.
Thanks, Juan. Nagesh, please.
Yeah. So what I found in Indian context is, yes, we should continue, the academician should continue prototypes, proof of concept, but the way to scale in Indian context, at least I have seen, is to work with NGOs, non-governmental organizations, capacity building organizations. So they come from they are a good mediators between semi-literate stakeholders and engineers, academicians kind of people. So what I try is, okay, I have tried this in my village. I go to my NGO friends. They come strongly from the stakeholder side. They live with them, but they don't concentrate on analysis as much. So I throw away my models. I try to start from their side of how they gather data, what they do with it, and see if I can somehow infuse these into their working style. You have to subsume or whatever, put yours aside and try to start from their side is how I try. For example, I came up with all these LCD, GIS, gather data. But finally, they felt, no, print it on flexi sheet. Let's take it to the field. People will write on it. We bring it back and then we input it. So how to simplify so that people don't lose control of the process? Things like that is how I have tried. I found NGOs a great intermediary between academics and practice. Yeah.
Thanks, Nagesh. Laura.
Yeah, Nagesh, so this is a great question. And Nagesh, you made a really important point that I want to reemphasize about the importance of boundary organizations. So these are chronically underappreciated and underfunded organizations that play a critical role in connecting academia with communities. So I'm thinking about, NGOs being one example, and in India, it sounds like is active, extension services, offices of outreach, community-based organizations that have some technical knowledge and capacity to interface with academic organizations. These are often the organizations that really facilitate these types of collaborations. And that was certainly the case with us in Flint. We worked with the Community Foundation of Greater Flint and also our own university's Office of Outreach and Engagement to make those connections. And in our case, I think the reason why a lot of these are academic initiated is because communities just don't know these tools are out there. They haven't heard of them. They don't realize how powerful they can be to help address problems that are of real concern to them. Once they find out, often they're very excited about them, in my experience. And so the community in Flint actually reached out to us with this particular, they were the ones that helped scope the research problem. So in that case, they were interested in using these tools to answer that, but that was because they had prior exposure to them through some of my work with the Office of Outreach and Engagement. So I think, it is this kind of like catch-22 a little bit, that like we have these really powerful tools that are really useful. People don't know about them, so they don't think to ask about them. But once you start building those connections and that network, hopefully that word gets out there. And boundary organizations are critical for doing that, as Nagesh pointed out. Yeah.
So thank you very much. Those were great answers. I think the combination of the boundary organizations and then Juan's comment about prototypes, because that way you don't go too far down a path and get stuck on your specific question, et cetera, before you get that input. So thanks for those answers.
Thanks, Margaret. And if I can add also here, I think we as a community need to put more into this, like treating it as a scientific investigation, because I think there is lots of hypotheses that dominate the practice of participatory modeling. Just take the idea of participation in its own right. The more participation, the merrier. I think we need to test this and get more specification of when participation is helpful at one point in the process, for what outcome. So I think this is what perhaps will address Margaret's first question around, is it a scientific discipline? So I think there is more work to do in this space. So yes, back to you panelists. Any questions for each other, reflections on each other's presentation?
I was just going to tell Juan, I think your typology of problems was very helpful, and I totally agree with all of the issues you raised. And I was reflecting on kind of number one, how do we create a pipeline of people who have the kind of unique skill set needed to do this work? And I'm wondering what you think about, lately I've been reflecting on, is there a parallel track for community partners and activists to gain some of these skills? We've been talking about academics, but folks that are in the community that often already have that kind of embedded knowledge and systems view of problems, can they gain some technical skills? Maybe they're going to be agent-based modelers, maybe they're not, maybe they're going to stick with qualitative, but at least some kind of system skills to be able to facilitate this participatory modeling from that end. And is that a better way to scale some of these tools? I'm curious what you think about that.
I think it's a great idea. It hadn't occurred to me. I was coming more from the academic side of things, where there's a few PhD students that we've come across that can do this, but they're very rare, and it's almost you want to clone them. But you're right. These people you mentioned have a stake in the system. They have their boots on the ground, and if we could give them the technical skills to use these powerful tools, that maybe they would. I'm pretty confident they make great practitioners. You're absolutely right.
Nagesh.
So Laura, in this system dynamics, I tried using the causal loop diagram itself. Looks quite difficult for my village people. With difficulty, we simplify and we try to get them to draw those. But then to generate simulations from them, we had to go through some equations, stock flow diagram, and that parameterizing them was just beyond them. I didn't know how to overcome that aspect. So is there anything you can say on that? Or
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's similar to my experience, that as you get into the more technical and quantitative aspects of the modeling, there are fewer and fewer people who are really interested in being engaged with that, but that might be okay. I really do believe in opening up the process, but letting people tell you how they want to be involved and when. And yeah, in my experience, the number of people that really want to get into the nitty gritty and see how you're building the equations and the stock and flow structure is very small. There's always a couple that are like really into it, but most people are like, you know what? We built the structure, you're going to take it and do your magic and bring it back to us. And I'm okay with that. And yeah, I think that that's okay if they trust that process and they can see that what they told you is represented in the model and their worldview is represented. They seem okay with that, in my experience.
maybe in my case, I will bring my teachers and local teachers get involved so that they know their people were involved even in that stage. But we go back finally for the analysis.
And Laura, I was mind blown by the idea of having the archetypes painted by communities, and on the that seems to be an amazing window of opportunity, and also an opportunity for people to become modelers, participatory modelers themselves. So that's great to hear. It's very exciting.
Yeah, I agree. It wasn't my idea, so I can't take credit for it. I wish I could, but yeah, I'm really excited to see what they come up with. Absolutely.
So on the archetypes, Laura, I really love them, but I wonder if, because they are stories or perhaps templates of what could happen in the system, how do you deal with the risk that people start force-fitting their issues and problems through the archetype? Have you encountered this in your practice, and how you deal with this risk?
Yeah, that's a great question. So what we did was actually an emergent coding from the stories people were telling us. So we explicitly wanted to avoid that. And so we had a very open-ended set of questions that we asked in focus groups around the city, which was basically, what would you like the food system in Flint to look like in the future? And what does it look like now? And what are the barriers of getting from here to there? And so they just talked about the food system in their own experience. And from that, we had a group of systems modelers who coded those focus groups. Now, in retrospect, I would have done some things differently. This is our first time doing it. So in retrospect, I would have had a systems modeler present at each focus group interview to prompt people. We didn't have that. And so sometimes people would get kind of halfway through a story and then not complete the thought. And so we had like half of an archetype, whereas if one of us was there, we could have said, oh, and what is causing that? And how do you think, we could have like elicited it from people without necessarily forcing it into a certain box, but asked more causal questions. I find that that's one thing that systems modelers do that's really valuable, is we ask the causal questions and people don't necessarily come out with that on their own. So that is one piece of advice I would give to anyone who wants to build models from interview transcripts or focus group transcripts. Have a modeler ask those causal questions, or train your people to do that, because that's one thing we didn't do very well. So learn from our mistake.
Nagesh.
Yeah, so I work at small case studies, and their politicians are small time and they are part of the stakeholders. But as the case becomes bigger, they become bigger. How does Laura and others handle larger player politicians? Do they come under CPO, or how do you? I'm finding it a problem as I try to scale up.
why is it a problem, Nagesh? Say more, like, is it just like what makes it difficult to engage those folks?
So this archetype, whatever you said, right? Even their speaking is very tailored. They have an issue, whereas a local stakeholder, you catch hold of a semi-literate woman, she's willing to speak out what her issues are. These guys are more, they know what they want, they have the end goal, and they're, it's,
So the way I would think about, sorry, Nagesh, go ahead.
So the way I go is I go to larger CBOs whom I trust, but that's not always working out. I just wanted to know how.
So I think this may be part of this is like the stakeholder analysis that you do at the start of the process to understand why would you invite them, what knowledge or interest they have in the project, and involve them at the right point in the discussion, and and tailor the activity perhaps to get what you would like to get from them. So I think maybe the stakeholder analysis could help in anticipating what they could bring to the process. Any experience from Laura or Juan dealing with politicians?
Nagesh, maybe one possible solution is that we've been trying to apply the idea of many models or multiple models or shuttle models. So then, because obviously you're working with people from different levels and they speak different languages, not like languages like English, Spanish, but different languages, like the way they speak about issues. So almost you need to have the ability to tailor the model or how you present the model to these different people. So then it speaks to them at their level. So usually I find as you go up, you have to simplify sometimes. The management, usually they're very scared about models and you need to explain things very, very simply. It's counterintuitive. And then as you go to the lay person, sometimes you can talk about feedbacks and in the language of archetypes without a problem. So it's just having the ability to engage with different types of people with different types of models, different versions of a model.
Yeah, Nagesh, I mean, I think what you're asking about is what do you do with somebody who just has an agenda and is not going to budge from that agenda, no matter, and I confess, I've met those people, I've had similar, and I don't really know. One thing that I have seen is if there's somebody from their office you can work with, or somebody who has their ear, who's maybe a little bit more open, who is, willing to participate in the dialogue. But yeah, it is tough. I mean, at the end of the day, if somebody has their mind made up and is not willing to listen to, then my question is, why are you in a decision-making position in the first place? Because that seems like maybe you shouldn't be, but we all know that they are. So, what do you do with that? I'm not sure.
You also get very little time with them. They've in one situation, they asked us to explain a 2-year model that took 2 years to build in 5 minutes. So you don't get much time to explain and get the ideas across to them.
And they control all the funds.
Yeah.
So they have power.
Right.
I would like to move to another point which Moira talked about in her presentation, which is the evaluation and the assessment of the participatory modeling activities. So I would love to hear from you your experience around the evaluation question. How do you think about it? What is the pragmatic thing to do to show evidence, while at the same time we're all aware of the time resource that could go to the evaluation? So what's your take on this?
Yeah, my take on evaluation is stakeholder perceptions. Test of pudding is eating it or something like that, they say. So very often, finally, the models that we have built, are they answering their questions, their problems? It should be the final score for evaluating a model, I feel, even if their perceptions are a little subjective and things like that.
Laura, I understand you have experience in evaluation in the case study that you shared with us. Would you like to shed some light on this?
Yeah, well, not me personally, but we were working with an excellent evaluator for our Flint project, and he uses participatory evaluation methods, which I also think is really cool. And I highly suggest building evaluation and assessment into your projects from the beginning and making sure you have the budget and the time for that. It's invaluable. But so he design and evaluation process for us by which we asked both community partners and the research team at the beginning of the project, like what would you like to see if this project is successful? What outputs, what processes, what, outcomes? And we have a range of those things that we can, evaluate at the end of the project. And they include things like, from the community side, the outputs of the research are used in policy conversations or are shared, in the discussions at the city level. We see, real people, NGOs in the city can take things that are useful for them, obviously practical things. And then the researchers, of course, we want, academic outputs as well as systems change. So yeah, I think everybody knows that, you can't necessarily always trace a straight line from, we did this project and then everything changed and it was wonderful. I mean, that's not the way that the real world works, but does it change the conversation? Are there things that are useful that people deem worthwhile in terms of carrying that policy discussion forward? I think you can measure those, hopefully.
I feel we're lacking standards to do it. Usually we tack a survey or something at the end, and for some reason I don't understand, we don't have like well agreed on standards. And that could address the question on testing, or the issue of testing hypothesis and comparing across projects. So that, and maybe my theory is that, and speaking to what Nagesh was saying before, we're dealing here with perceptions, and perceptions are very difficult to capture and quantify. But yeah, we're lacking some good standards of how to evaluate.
And perhaps monitor as well, because you would like to keep an eye on the process, not just evaluate at the end. Nagesh, any last minute thoughts?
One just, there used to be a lot of work under the heading PRA, Participatory Resource Appraiser, Rural Appraiser, in the 60s, 70s, 80s. And that used to be quite subjective, permitting reporting of case studies without the rigor of this EMS kind of journals, right? So whereas I find now PM is going too rigorous. You can't just like that narrate a case study anywhere. I feel PM should connect back to the earlier participatory approaches, which were driven by the NGOs, the CBOs. I don't know how the connection is to be made. That should also be encouraged, not the rigorous data kind.
Yeah, I think we need to embrace a wide range of evaluation approaches, which really capture the multiple perspectives that makes the field. So I'm afraid this is all what we have time for. The time has really flown. I would like to thank you all for your participation. I would like to thank Moira, Nagesh, Juan, and Laura. And I would like to thank Caroline and Elena for all the back-end work. Thanks for Succinct, Tiez, and Sesmo for bringing us together to do this event today. And as Margaret noted, at the beginning, mark the date, the 29th of November, we'll have Serena Hamilton and Tony Jakeman to talk about how we could select an integrated modeling approach. Till I see you then and there, please take care and stay well. Thank you, everyone.